there is a quiet catastrophe unfolding in the minds of millions, and almost no one is talking about it. Not because they are ignoring it, but because they cannot see it. The very capacity to recognize the problem has become the problem itself. We are not living through an age of information. We are living through an age of engineered certainty, where the most dangerous thing you can do is think for yourself. Critical thinking, once the cornerstone of education, democracy, and human progress, is vanishing, not through conspiracy or censorship, but through something far more insidious. It is being made obsolete by design, and the result is not just ignorance. It is collective stupidity, a mass incapacity to process reality that leaves entire populations vulnerable to manipulation, polarization, and self-destruction. To understand how we got here, you have to understand what critical thinking actually is. It is not skepticism for its own sake. It is not contrarianism or cynicism or the reflexive rejection of mainstream narratives. Critical thinking is the disciplined practice of examining evidence, questioning assumptions, recognizing biases, and arriving at conclusions through reason rather than reflex. It is slow. It is uncomfortable. It requires you to hold contradictory ideas in your mind simultaneously without collapsing into the comfort of premature certainty. And most importantly, it requires you to be wrong often, publicly, and with genuine humility. This is why critical thinking is dying. Not because people are getting dumber, but because the systems that govern modern life have made it irrational to think critically. The first engine of this decline is the architecture of digital platforms. Social media, search engines, and recommendation algorithms are not designed to inform you. They are designed to engage you. And engagement is maximized not by truth, but by emotion. The algorithm does not care whether you understand a complex issue. It cares whether you react to it. And the most reliable reactions fear, outrage, tribal solidarity, moral superiority, are the exact emotions that critical thinking suppresses. When you think critically, you pause, you consider alternative explanations. You withhold judgment until you have sufficient evidence, but the algorithm punishes pause. It rewards immediate reaction. It feeds you content calibrated to trigger your amygdala before your prefrontal cortex can engage, and over time, this conditioning rewires your brain. You begin to mistake feeling for thinking. You begin to seek content that confirms your emotional state rather than challenging it. You become, in essence, a reaction machine rather than a reasoning being. The second engine is the collapse of epistemic trust. There was a time when institutions, universities, newspapers, scientific bodies, government agencies served as gatekeepers of reliable information. They were imperfect, often biased, sometimes corrupt, but they maintained standards. They had processes. They were slow and bureaucratic by design, because getting things right is slower than getting them viral. Today, those institutions have either been captured by ideological interests or have lost public trust through their own failures. The result is an epistemic free-for-all, where every source is suspect, every expert is agenda-driven, and every claim is equally contestable. This sounds like it should promote critical thinking. If you can't trust anyone, shouldn't you evaluate everything yourself? But human beings are not equipped to evaluate everything themselves. We are finite creatures with finite time and finite expertise. The collapse of institutional trust does not produce independent thinkers. It produces people who substitute one form of authority for another, often less accountable, more emotionally satisfying, and more perfectly aligned with their existing biases. This is where the third engine comes in. The rise of parasitic epistemic communities. These are not communities in the traditional sense. They are not bound by geography, shared experience, or mutual obligation. They are bound by narrative. They are bound by the shared story that explains why the world is the way it is, who is responsible, and what must be done. These communities offer something that critical thinking cannot: certainty, belonging, and moral clarity. They tell you who the heroes are. who the villains are, and where you stand in the drama. They provide identity, purpose, and the intoxicating feeling of being one of the few who sees the truth while the masses sleep, and they protect this identity by making critical thinking synonymous with betrayal. To question the narrative is to question the community. To consider alternative explanations is to be a useful idiot for the enemy. The result is a self-sealing epistemic bubble, where the very tools of reason questioning, doubting, testing are redefined as vices rather than virtues. The fourth engine is educational failure. Critical thinking has become a buzzword in curricula worldwide, but it is rarely taught as a practice. It is taught as a concept. Students learn about logical fallacies without learning to recognize them in real-time argumentation. They learn about cognitive biases without learning to interrogate their own. They are asked to think critically about assigned texts while being graded on whether their conclusions align with the instructor's expectations. The result is a generation that can name the tools of critical thinking without knowing how to use them. They can identify ad hominem attacks in a textbook example but miss them in a viral tweet. They can define confirmation bias but cannot recognize it in their own information diet. This is performative critical thinking, the appearance of rigor without the substance. And it is arguably more dangerous than no critical thinking at all, because it creates the illusion of competence where none exists. The fifth engine is the speed of modern life. Critical thinking is slow. It requires time to gather information, to sit with complexity, to revise conclusions as new evidence emerges. But modern life is engineered for speed. News cycles compress from weeks to hours to minutes. Decisions that once took months are demanded in days. Conversations that once unfolded over letters now happen in real-time threads where hesitation is interpreted as weakness and nuance is impossible within character limits. The person who pauses to think is outpaced by the person who reacts immediately. The person who says, "I don't know yet," is drowned out by the person who has a confident take. And over time, the cognitive style that succeeds in this environment is not the careful deliberator. It is the fast pattern matcher, the intuitive responder, the person who can generate plausible-sounding certainty faster than anyone can fact-check it. Speed has become the enemy of depth, and depth is where critical thinking lives. The sixth engine is the politicization of everything. There was a time when certain domains, mathematics, engineering, basic science, were considered relatively neutral territory where evidence could be evaluated without immediate reference to ideological commitments. Those times are gone. Today, almost every issue has been mapped onto a political spectrum, and that spectrum has become binary. You are either on one side or the other, and the middle is not a position but a target. This polarization makes critical thinking socially costly. If you examine the evidence on a charged issue and arrive at a conclusion that does not align perfectly with your tribe's position, you are not seen as a thinker. You are seen as a traitor. The social cost of independent thought has risen so high that for many people it is rational to outsource their thinking to their political identity. It is safer to believe what your side believes than to risk the ostracism that comes with genuine intellectual independence. The seventh engine is the replacement of text with image and video. Reading is an inherently critical activity. It requires you to construct meaning from abstract symbols, to hold complex arguments in working memory, to follow extended chains of reasoning across paragraphs and pages. It trains the brain in the very skills that critical thinking requires: patience, abstraction, sequential logic. Video and image, by contrast, are experiential. They bypass many of the cognitive processes that text engages. They deliver emotion directly without the mediating step of interpretation. They are harder to interrogate because they feel like evidence rather than argument. A photograph seems to show what is. A video seems to capture reality. The critical questions: who took this, when, from what angle, with what editing, for what purpose require an extra layer of cognitive effort that most viewers never apply. And as media consumption shifts from text to video, from books to streams, from articles to reels, the cognitive muscles that critical thinking depends on atrophy from disuse. The eighth engine is the commodification of attention. Your attention is the most valuable resource in the digital economy, and every platform is optimized to extract it. But attention is finite, and the competition for it has created an arms race of stimulation. Content must be more shocking, more provocative, more emotionally charged than the content it competes with. This arms race does not produce better information. It produces more addictive information. And addiction is the opposite of critical engagement. The addict does not evaluate the substance. The addict seeks the hit. The design of modern media is not accidental. It is deliberately engineered to bypass your critical faculties and trigger your reward systems directly. The result is a population that is not uninformed but misinformed passionately, confidently, addictively misinformed. They do not lack information. They lack the capacity to evaluate the information they have because the systems that delivered it have systematically disabled the evaluative machinery. The ninth engine is the disappearance of shared reality. Critical thinking presupposes a shared framework of evidence and standards. You cannot debate someone if you do not agree on what counts as evidence, what counts as a valid argument, or even what counts as a fact. But in the current environment, these frameworks have fragmented. Different communities operate with different epistemic standards, different trusted sources, and different criteria for what constitutes proof. A scientific study is evidence to one group and corporate propaganda to another. A first-hand account is testimony to one audience and anecdote to another. The result is not disagreement, but incommensurability. People talking past each other because they do not share enough common ground for genuine debate to be possible. And when debate becomes impossible, critical thinking becomes irrelevant. There is nothing to think critically about if there is no agreement on what there is to think about. The 10th engine is the psychological comfort of stupidity. Thinking is hard. Uncertainty is painful. The world is complex, ambiguous, and often indifferent to our desire for clear answers. Collective stupidity offers an escape from this discomfort. It allows you to outsource your thinking to a group, to adopt ready-made conclusions, to feel certain without the labor of becoming certain. It provides the psychological benefits of knowledge confidence, identity, moral clarity without the cognitive costs of actual knowledge. This is not a conscious choice for most people. It is a drift, a gradual surrender to the path of least resistance. The human mind is naturally lazy, and collective stupidity is the ultimate mental shortcut. It is the path of least cognitive effort, and in a world designed to maximize cognitive load, it is the path most people will take. The consequences of this decline are already visible. Democracies are paralyzed by populations that cannot agree on basic facts. Public health is undermined by the viral spread of medical misinformation. Scientific progress is slowed by the politicization of research. Social cohesion is eroded by the fragmentation of shared understanding. And individual lives are damaged by decisions made on the basis of emotion, tribal loyalty, and algorithmic manipulation, rather than evidence and reason. Collective stupidity is not a victimless phenomenon. It is a public health crisis, a democratic crisis, and a civilizational crisis. And it is accelerating because the systems that produce it are becoming more sophisticated, more embedded, and more difficult to escape. But the most dangerous consequence is the one that operates at the individual level. The person who loses the capacity for critical thinking loses the capacity for genuine autonomy. They become a node in a network they do not understand, reacting to stimuli they did not choose, believing things they have not examined, and acting on the basis of impulses that have been engineered by systems designed to exploit them. They are not free. They are managed. And the tragedy is that they do not know it. The managed mind does not experience its management as constraint. It experiences it as choice, as preference, as identity. The cage is invisible because it has been built inside the mind itself. The question, then, is whether this decline can be reversed. And the honest answer is, only with enormous difficulty, and only by individuals who are willing to pay a price. Critical thinking cannot be restored at the collective level until it is restored at the individual level. And the individual who chooses to think critically in an environment designed to prevent it is choosing a path of resistance that will be socially costly, cognitively demanding, and often emotionally isolating. They will be slower to form opinions than their peers, which will be interpreted as weakness. They will be willing to change their minds when evidence demands it, which will be interpreted as inconsistency. They will refuse to adopt the certainty that their tribes demand, which will be interpreted as betrayal. They will be, in short, inconvenient, and inconvenient people are not rewarded by systems designed for compliance. But they are the only people who can eventually change those systems. The recovery of critical thinking begins with the individual decision to reclaim your own mind. This means, first, recognizing that your attention is not yours in the way you think it is. It has been colonized by platforms, algorithms, and interests that do not have your flourishing in mind. Reclaiming it requires deliberate, often uncomfortable choices. Limit your exposure to algorithmic feeds. Read long-form text. Engage with ideas that challenge your current beliefs, not as performance, but as practice. Seek out the strongest versions of positions you disagree with, rather than the weakest versions that are easiest to dismiss. These are not one-time actions. They are habits, and habits require repetition over time. Second, the recovery of critical thinking requires the cultivation of intellectual humility. This is not the same as self-deprecation or false modesty. It is the genuine recognition that your mind is limited, that your current beliefs are probably wrong in ways you cannot yet see, and that the person who disagrees with you may know something you do not. This humility is the foundation of all learning, because it creates the psychological space for correction. The person who is certain cannot learn. The person who is curious can, and curiosity is the antidote to the premature certainty that collective stupidity demands. Third, the recovery requires the rebuilding of epistemic trust, but not blind trust. You cannot evaluate everything yourself. You must develop the capacity to identify trustworthy sources, to understand their methods and limitations, and to triangulate between multiple perspectives. This is not the same as trusting institutions uncritically. It is the development of a more sophisticated, more nuanced form of trust that recognizes expertise without deifying it, that acknowledges bias without dismissing everything as propaganda. It is the capacity to say, this source is more reliable than that one. Not because it is perfect, but because its methods are more transparent. Its track record is better, and its incentives are more aligned with truth-seeking. Fourth, the recovery requires the willingness to be wrong in public. This is perhaps the hardest step because it involves social risk. But critical thinking is not a private activity. It is a social practice, and it requires the testing of ideas against the scrutiny of others. The person who only thinks in private never has their assumptions challenged. They never encounter the evidence that might change their mind. They never develop the resilience that comes from having your arguments defeated and your conclusions revised. Public discourse, when conducted in good faith, is the gymnasium of critical thinking. And the retreat from public discourse into private echo chambers is the retreat from the very practice that keeps minds sharp. Fifth, the recovery requires patience. Critical thinking is not a state you achieve. It is a practice you maintain. It is a muscle that atrophies without use and strengthens with exercise. You cannot read one book, have one difficult conversation, or question one assumption and consider the job done. You must build it into the structure of your life. You must make it a habit, a default, a way of being in the world. And you must do this, knowing that the systems around you are working against you, that the incentives are aligned for stupidity, that the path of least resistance leads downward. You are swimming against the current, and the current is strong. The stakes could not be higher. We are not just talking about individual flourishing, though that matters. We are talking about the capacity of human societies to solve the problems that threaten their survival. Climate change, pandemic preparedness, nuclear proliferation, artificial intelligence, governance. These are not problems that can be solved by collective stupidity. They require the very things that are disappearing. The ability to evaluate complex evidence, to hold uncertainty without collapsing into tribal certainty, to make decisions based on long-term reasoning rather than immediate emotional gratification. If critical thinking does not recover, these problems will not be solved. They will be managed badly by the same systems that produced them until they overwhelm us. This is not a call to optimism. The forces arrayed against critical thinking are powerful, well-funded, and deeply embedded in the architecture of modern life. They will not be defeated by a few individuals reading more books, but they can be resisted. And resistance, sustained over time by enough people, can shift the equilibrium. The first step is to see the problem clearly. The second step is to refuse to participate in your own diminishment. The third step is to build, in your own life and in the lives of those you influence, the habits and practices that sustain critical thought, even in hostile environments. The rise of collective stupidity is not a natural disaster. It is a man-made catastrophe, engineered by systems that profit from our cognitive weakness and protected by our willingness to surrender our minds for the comfort of certainty. But the same agency that created this catastrophe can also reverse it. You can choose to think. You can choose to question. You can choose to bear the discomfort of uncertainty rather than the false comfort of premature conclusion. These choices are available to you right now, in this moment, regardless of what the algorithms are feeding you, what your tribe demands, or what the speed of modern life insists upon. The mind is the only territory you truly control. And it is being colonized. The question is whether you will fight for it. Not with outrage, not with tribal loyalty, not with the performative certainty that passes for thought on every platform, but with the slow, difficult, unglamorous work of genuine reasoning, of examining your own assumptions with the same rigor you apply to others, of seeking evidence that might disprove your beliefs rather than only evidence that confirms them, of living in the discomfort of not knowing until knowing is actually possible. This is the work. It is not exciting. It will not go viral. It will not earn you the approval of your tribe or the admiration of the masses. But it is the only work that matters, because it is the foundation of everything else. Without it, you are not a citizen. You are a subject. Without it, you are not a person. You are a product. Without it, you are not free. You are managed. And the managers do not have your interests at heart. The disappearance of critical thinking is the great crisis of our age, hidden in plain sight, accelerating in every feed and protected by the very minds it is destroying. To resist it is to become strange, inconvenient, and often alone. But it is also to become human in the fullest sense of the word, being capable of reason, of autonomy, of genuine choice in a world designed to eliminate all three. The choice is yours. It has always been yours, and it is the only choice that ultimately matters.